English translation 370th contact. Friday, 31st December 2004, 004 hours.
Welcome to my lair, Ptah, dear friend. Be greeted.
I also want to offer you my greetings, dear Edward, dear friend.
With your permission, I would like to ask you a few questions at the outset.
Your questions will revolve around the seaquake catastrophe in Southeast Asia, if I am not mistaken.
That is correct. Firstly, I would like to ask you what you have noticed in the meantime with regard to the many dead. How high do you now calculate the real number?
The latest number is no longer based on probability calculations, but on data that we have obtained through our equipment. According to the analyses based on the fact that our devices and equipment record biograms of various species, that is to say of living and deceased life forms, we have obtained very accurate data. In relation to human beings who lost their lives in all the affected areas of the disaster, the exact data at 1714 hours this evening amount to 281,078.
So, that is the number of deaths that have been recorded by the equipment without any living human beings among them?
The figure is only for those who are deceased. As I have already explained, our devices and apparatuses are designed to locate and record living or deceased life forms. Many of those killed by the disaster have been buried deep under muddy ground or dragged far out into the sea, where they will never be found again. Our entire technology of recording and recording biograms is so perfected that we can analyze each life form specifically and also determine its condition. This enables us to determine the exact time of death as well as whether it is a human, animal, or other life form. Furthermore, our devices and equipment record whether it is a female or male life form, what age it is, and by what circumstances it has lost its life. On the mainland, the sensors work down to a depth of about 8,000 meters, while in the water, depths of up to 12,000 meters are possible.
So it is absolutely certain that the 281,078 deaths you have recorded are all direct and indirect victims of the flood disaster.
That is the essence of my statement. And our records are extremely precise and are not subject to error. However, in the countries affected by the disaster, due to an inaccurate registration of population figures, it will be impossible to give exact details of missing persons, and consequently the exact number of those killed can never really be determined. For our part, however, we can give the exact number because our biographical recorders work perfectly.
So that is clear. But you also mentioned that tsunamis can reach speeds of up to 1,500 kilometers per hour, which is supersonic. Is that really possible?
Under certain conditions, it is actually possible, such as when a meteor or comet hits the sea. It is also possible that tidal waves of up to 1,000 meters height and more are created, which can also be possible under certain conditions, when huge volcanoes explode in a sea or, as said, meteors or comets crash into the sea.
Almost unimaginable, and a thing that our earthly scientists are not aware of, and therefore will naturally deny, as I can imagine. Many of them are so narrow-minded that they deny and doubt everything that their minds cannot grasp, and that exceeds their knowledge.
An evil that actually exists among very many earthly scientists who are extremely arrogant and want to know everything better than the things that correspond to the truth.
Our scientists say that the two seaquakes in Southeast Asia shifted the axis of the Earth by 6 to 10 centimeters. Is that really true?
There has indeed been a shift of the Earth's axis, but the measure you mentioned is not true, because in reality there was a shift of 12.4 centimeters.
You spoke of the danger of epidemics and diseases that might be imminent. You mentioned cholera, typhus, dysentery, and malaria. What else could there be?
To list everything would be nonsense, because there are about 50 different germs caused by the contaminated water, the contaminated drinking water, the lack of food, and various other factors.
Probably also dengue fever, I suppose.
That also, of course. But the natural disaster does not end with the epidemics and diseases, because many irresponsible human beings are also doing their part to make the catastrophe even worse and let it get out of hand. For many business-making locals and foreigners, as well as for many tourists, the initial shock was over after only 2 days, because the businessmen are already diligently doing everything they can to promote tourism again. This, while the tourists, completely indifferent, inhuman and inhumane, as well as unscrupulous towards all the hardship and all the misery of those affected, are already spreading again in the destroyed tourist places and on the beaches and behaving as if the world belongs to them alone. In addition to this, those who are irresponsible in various countries engage in disgraceful disaster tourism, whereby these kinds of tourists feast on the hardship and misery of those affected by the disaster and record everything without decency on films and photos, in order to then brag about it back home with their family and acquaintances and friends, etc. But even that is not enough for the tourists, because some pedophile elements, among them relatives of the helpers, do not hesitate to sexually abuse girls and boys or even kidnap them for sexual abuse, while other degenerate tourists and helpers sexually rape totally disturbed women. There are also already criminal local gangs at work who kidnap children from reception camps to trade with them. Child trafficking is based on the sale of children to well-heeled people who have no children of their own, or they are traded as work slaves or used in child prostitution. All this, while also local people rape distraught women in the reception camps, carry out looting, burglarize the houses of missing persons and still reasonably intact tourist hotels. Other gangs of criminals raid and rob transports with relief supplies, only to sell the goods to the needy at high prices. Criminality is booming in the affected disaster areas, as is the shamefulness of all profiteers who want to gain great wealth through the hardship and the misery of those affected, for which they are without conscience and unscrupulously entitled to all evil and illegal means. And these shameful elements and reprehensible creatures are both locals and foreigners who have settled in the disaster countries affected. It is also a fact that good business is already being done with tourism again. However, it is not that the population of the country benefits from it, but only the governments and those who are directly involved in tourism and earn their money with it, relatively speaking. However, this is only a very small percentage of the total population, so that only this small part of the population benefits from tourism and leads a better or good life, while the majority of the population continues to live in poverty or has to make a more or less bad living.
And what do you say to the aid that is being or will be provided by the USA?
37. As far as I know, America is acting on behalf of President George W. Bush, and the whole thing is just an alibi exercise on his part. On the one hand, to keep up the appearance of responsible helpfulness, and on the other hand, to put itself, America, in a good and loving light, but ultimately all for the purpose of gaining influence and establishing itself in the Southeast Asian states, which are still suffering and not functioning properly. Of course, nobody wants to admit this because the truth is not asked for but frowned upon.
You mean that this is really the case?
This is not simply my opinion, but it is based on an empirical value that is based on the entire political and military posturing and fuss of the U.S. President Bush Jr., as well as on the actions of those of the U.S., who are of the same reprehensible action and sense.
By which, of course, not all the American people can be meant. But only all those who follow the path you mentioned and who are in the same horn as the upper echelons of those who have gotten very badly out of control of their good human nature, who lead the country and the people.
That is my opinion, yes.
When I spoke about the profit-greedy aid organizations, by which I of course also only meant those who are really only keen on the dirty lucre in order to collect horrendous wages from them and who organize their administration through donations, you spoke of the fact that such aid organizations should work purely on a voluntary basis and be organized by the state. Can you tell me how this is to be handled, perhaps by the military? And what about if any groups or organizations are active in the field of aid for natural disasters, etc., and if they only work on a voluntary basis, is it right for them to receive donations? For my part, I think that this is fair and just, because then every cent effectively goes to the needy and those in need of help.
Which you are absolutely right about. You and all the members of the FIGU are also acting within this framework, as I told you on my last visit. All your actions stand out from all the official aid organizations in this respect, because you are really acting in an honorary capacity, and you are not going public to make yourselves big and to appear before the public. You act in silence, just as individuals do privately, who quietly provide valuable help in an honorary, modest, profitless, and selfless manner. It should be forbidden by law for aid organizations which accept financial or other donations to deduct any percentage of these for administration and for the remuneration of their staff. It does not matter how high or low these percentages are set, because even the deduction of 1% or even 1 cent for their own purposes means a shameful theft and fraud against the donors and those in need of help. In any case, help may only be given completely unselfishly and voluntarily, because all help is a matter of honor and is conditioned by true humanity. This was recognized in our country at an early stage, which is why corresponding laws were passed, which forbid any profiteering by the diversion of donations. And it is a fact that all those who receive any kind of percentages and rewards from donations only give their help for the sake of percentages and rewards, but not for the sake of real help, for the sake of helping humans in need. Such humans see their help as pure work that has to be paid for, but not as a really good deed and help for their fellow humans. This is a fact I have already heard, but it will be vehemently denied by all those who act within this framework.
I can vividly imagine. I can already hear the roaring wailing when our conversation about this becomes officially known. All the fallible ones will howl and try to tear us both apart in the air.
Which you will certainly be right about. But what you asked about state aid organizations, I would like to explain the following. With us, the task of disaster relief and the like was placed very early on in the administration of the state, whereby the police and security forces were trained for this purpose, made responsible and remunerated through the normal state revenues. Donations collected for relief operations were used down to the last cent for what they were intended for. And today, as we no longer have any financial resources whatsoever, the regular law and order and security bodies are still responsible for relief operations in the event of disasters. Of course, we also have many volunteers who carry out valuable operations in the event of disasters. But these are managed by the competent bodies because there must be a certain order on which any real assistance depends.
Then there are also natural disasters in your country?
Not on Era itself, because there everything is kept under control and properly organized. But there are still different worlds in our widely ramified federation, on which often great natural disasters occur, where great damage is done and loss of life is to be lamented. Here we provide organized help through our law and order and security forces, with the participation of volunteers who carry out their duties voluntarily and selflessly.
So this means that when you speak of you are not talking about Era, but about other worlds which belong to your Federation, and which are not yet as far along in terms of mastering the forces of nature as you Erans are. Is that right?
Yes, that is the sense of my words. On Era, we have everything so controlled, organized, and legislated in relation to natural disasters that no one can be harmed if nature allows its forces to play. We do not influence nature in such a form that we would completely tame it, but the influence is only in responsible forms of weather formation, etc. So the forces of nature can also unfold on Era, but they are tamed in their worst forms, so that no damage is done to human property and no human lives are lost. But now, dear friend, I would like to talk to you in a different and purely private way, so I hope that you have no more questions.
Actually, I do not right now.
Then I would like to start